Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Good Stuff. I'm Kevin Bille, and as always, we appreciate you joining us here today. Well, we've got a really good one today. We've got a Hall of Fame coach. He's an author. We're going to talk about that towards the end of the show. 8-time National Coach of the Year, and that's not a misprint. 8 times, and then if you think that's something, 22 times national champion. He is Anson Dorrance, the head women's soccer coach at University of North Carolina. Coach, it's great to have you.
Well, it's good to be with you. So thank you. Thanks for that gracious introduction.
Well, Coach, I'd love for you to take us back. I think, when I talk to people now, I think it's so important to have a vision and just know where you're going. Can you rewind it all the way to the beginning and kind of give us a little bit of what you thought the vision was going to be, and if that changed throughout the course of the year, especially with the success you were having?
If I went back to the beginning, actually, I'd have to share the truth, which is I never had any ambitions to coach. My father was an oil businessman, and he was starting his own oil company, and he wanted me to be his corporate attorney. So he felt the best route for me to go to assist him basically was to get a law degree. I loved my father. I was a dutiful son. And even though I had no real interest in the law, I went to law school as a favor to him. And in order to help pay for my law school education, the guy that I was playing for here at UNC, a wonderful man by the name of Dr. Marvin Allen, who was a part-time soccer coach and taught full-time in our exercise sports science department. He was retiring. And just before I entered law school, he basically went to the athletic director at UNC and said, I genuinely feel, Mr. Kobe, who was our athletic director, that this young man would do a good job succeeding me as the men's soccer coach here at UNC. And so basically, I jumped into his vacancy. I was in a law degree with, again, no ambitions of coaching once I finished the law degree, but this was a revenue stream. My wife was working full-time as a ballet teacher here and at Duke University, and this was my opportunity to contribute to the family income. And so I had no issue jumping in as the men's soccer coach here, originally as Marvin's assistant, actually in that first year in 1976 as his head coach designate. And then from 77 on, I was the head men's coach until 1988, where I decided, after we had adopted a women's team in 1979, and I coached both, I decided to just go with the women. So originally, I sort of backed up into coaching, and it was never an ambition. But I ended up absolutely loving it. I couldn't believe how much I enjoyed it. And much to my father's chagrin, I told him, this was going to be my passion. I was trying to finish my law degree. I had taken a course shy each semester in my first 3 years of law school. Most people finish law school in 3 years. I was going into my 4th year with 6 courses to go to finish the degree. And that was the year they added a women's team to my men's responsibilities. And it was just too much. I was getting 4 to 6 hours sleep at night. I was a zombie, and I came home one day and I told my poor wife, who thought she was going to retire in the Mediterranean on a yacht, that I was going to be a soccer coach. And what I loved about my wonderful wife is she had no issue with it. She saw how much I loved it. So from basically that year forward, I dropped out of law school in 1979, and I just did both teams for 10 years, and then from 89, just the women. So that was my sort of evolution into coaching, and it was never my ambitions, but oh my gosh, have I absolutely loved it.
Yeah, I bet. I'd be anxious to know how you've reinvented yourself along the way, or maybe freshened up ideas for, your program in that time.
Well, what was really interesting is I've always had a very analytical mind. The courses I took as an undergraduate that I did best in were math courses. Even though I majored in English and philosophy, my math grades were the best. I wasn't, to be honest, a particularly good student, but those math grades sort of got me into law school just because they helped my GPA a bit. So for me, I've always been very analytical. I love numbers. I love data collection. For me, I think what separated me as a coach early on is my competitive fire. In fact, the other day I was listening to a liberal commentator on MSNBC by the name of Rachel Maddow. And she had brought on some expert to pontificate on something. And as she's introducing the expert interrupted her and said, well, Rachel, what are you an expert in? And she sort of pulled back a little and reflected for a second. And she said, I am an expert on reading comprehension. And I was thinking to myself, that's a really interesting statement, because one of the reasons I love listening to her show is she's so incredibly articulate about explaining to me. And she's such an amazing storyteller. It's because she obviously reads about all these different environments that she talks about on her show and then does a great job explaining them to me. So all of a sudden, for the first time, and this happened within the last year, I was wondering to myself what I'm an expert in, because obviously we've had some success. But there are a lot of people out there that I think know as much about the game as I do. But I think I do have a quality that separates me. And so I've come to this conclusion. I am an expert on competition. I know how to structure it in practice. I know how to motivate it for my teams and players that play. And for me, in this 9 quality sort of player conference litany of things that we review for a player to achieve in order to hit her potential, the ring that rules them all, in my opinion, is competitive fire. So whenever I talk to a young player about these kids, and the sort of kids we recruit all have the ambition to sign a pro contract, and the more aggressive ones want to play on the U.S. full national team and the U.S. Olympic team. And we talk about self-discipline, competitive fire, self-belief, love of the ball, love of playing the game, love of watching the game, grit, coachability, and connection. And we have them evaluate themselves in those 9 areas. And the ring that rules them all, the most critical quality, in my opinion, for a kid to get to her potential is competitive fire. And I think that's the quality that I think I know how to coach best. And I think that's been one of the foundations for our success over the years.
That's really good. And I love this. I was going to talk about this anyhow, so we'll go right into it right now, because it seems like you're very intentional with it. It does seem like you're recording things and you're measuring things against, each other. What would you tell some of the listeners that are maybe at a small school or a high school and they're limited on, the data they collect? And I'd be anxious to know what you would prioritize, because sometimes I think there's staff restrictions, there's resource restrictions. What would maybe be like a top 3 to 5, somewhere in there of importance for you, what you would track to being 5 key measures when it comes down to this performance or future performance, especially when dealing with competition?
Well, thank you, because I think what's critical is you have to create a competitive cauldron in practice. If you want to compete at the highest possible level, and it doesn't matter what level you're coaching from, if you've got a middle school team or an elementary school team, a high school team, a junior college team, a Division III team, it doesn't matter what your level of coaching is. If you can create competition in practice, you're going to help your players get to their potential. So the first thing you've got to absolutely embrace in practice is the competitive athlete. And in so many environments, I see these competitive athletes come into these environments, and I see their coaches try to crush their competitive spirit just so the other players in practice can feel comfortable. I think they're doing that player and their team a disservice. Mm-hmm. If you have an absolute competitive warrior in practice, that player, assuming your training environments aren't all that competitive, they're going to be attacked by everyone under the sun, certainly every player in the training environment that are uncomfortable with this player that just goes after it 100 miles an hour. They're going to be attacked by the parents of the other players in practice that want to protect their little darlings from the chaos of the universe. But if you can figure out a way to protect that player and point to him or her as often as possible and say, you know what, that's how we're going to train. And I don't mean the player that goes around injuring everyone in order to win, or the one that cheats to win. No, I'm talking about the one that within the rules does everything he or she can to try to get a competitive result. You have to protect those players, because when you finally get one You've got to put them on a pedestal and say, that's how we're going to train. I had the wonderful privilege years ago of sort of recruiting one of these competitive warriors. And I can remember in the recruiting process when I was chasing her, I called her up one day, and I was so used to recruiting men. And recruiting men is unbelievably simple at a school of our level at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. You call up a young guy and say, hello, my name is Anson Dorrance. I'm the soccer coach at the University of North Carolina. I've seen you play. I think you can step in and start for us as a freshman. We've got some scholarship money for you. And they grunt a couple times and great, see you in August. That's the extent of men's recruiting. At a school like this, if you're going to give them a competitive enough scholarship, and if they can be assured that they're going to step in and compete to start first game as a freshman, you've got them. The conversation basically ends there. And I was thinking, obviously, I'm a brilliant recruiter of young men. I can't wait to use this recruiting technique on the young women I'm chasing. So I called up this kid from Littleton, Colorado by the name of April Heinrichs. And I had seen her play, and I was stunned at how good she was. And actually, at the time when I was recruiting her, she was playing junior college basketball. All the soccer programs in the country hadn't really seen her play. And I had, and I just was stunned at her level. So I called her up and I started talking to her, and I tried to use the old line of, I've seen you play. I think you can step in and start for me as a freshman. We got some money for you. I'm trying to hang the phone up. And she says, Coach, hang on. How does your team get along? I was thinking to myself, well, that's an interesting question. And every time I called her, we got money for you. I think you can step in and start for me at right wing. And I'm trying to hang the phone up. And again, how does your team get along? Every time I spoke to her, she kept asking me how my team got along. And honestly, I didn't know. But if this was important to her, I was thinking, well, April, they get along great. Who knew, who cared? And I just didn't understand the question. And all of a sudden she comes in, she decides to come to North Carolina in preseason. I understood why she asked that question, because in every single aspect of every practice, she ripped through people to win everything. And all of a sudden, one player after another is in my office. What are you going to do about April? What are you going to do about April? I was thinking to myself, well, clone her? Yeah. This is the greatest thing I had ever seen. What do you mean? You want me to get her to transfer to Duke? Do you want to play against her? Oh, no. We don't want to play against her. And I said, I want you guys to play like her. And the thing I loved about her, my assumption now, every team she had ever played on had rejected her because she was so competitive. She wanted to finally be in a culture that embraced who she was. There are a lot of people out there like that. And I think what ends up happening is they end up joining these cultures that are not competitive. And they are joining these employers or these coaches that stifle the spirit that I think is the ring that rules them all. So what we have to do is to protect these gems, protect them from the animosity and jealousy and the discomfort and the lack of resilience of the kids they're competing with in practice. And so that's what we've done. When I was appointed the U.S. Women's National Coach in 1986, the United States had never won a game in international competition. 5 years later, we were world champions. Who was the first player I picked for that roster in 1986? It was Heinrichs. I pointed to her and I told everyone, the national team, and these are the best of the best in the United States. I said, that's how we're going to train. We're going to train like sharks with blood in the water. You don't develop in a recreational environment. You develop by going right to the edge of your ability to win everything. And it's that competitive fire that's going to drive you, but also the people around you to keep up with you to their potential. And so I tell this to coaches all the time. You don't develop in a recreational environment. You develop by keeping score. You develop by putting on the bulletin board following a practice or before the next one. Who won the last practice? Who won the shooting exercise? Who won the 1v1s? Who won the fitness test? And you have all these measures up on the board because you want them to know all of these things matter. And I don't care if you're just a high school coach and you don't have a lot of assistants and you don't have a budget. You can keep scoring everything you want. All you got to do is to have a legal pad like I did my first couple of years coaching. And I recorded everything on that one legal pad. I was a one-man analytics army. until eventually I could hire Instat to find out in a game who the Russian trolls thought were my best players. So when they weren't, trying to elect Trump, they were basically evaluating, my soccer players through this incredible service where they would look at the recordings of my games and give me an evaluation of every player in every game. And then we would do that in practice. We have 11 managers now that record everything under the sun. And so we're just giving feedback to every player. But originally it was me and a legal pad, recording basically 1v1s, recording win-loss ties in half-field games, recording fitness results, which are so easy to record, recording basically your time in the 40-yard dash or in the 10-yard dash to measure your acceleration. So all these different things, every player and every coach can participate in, and it doesn't take that much effort to record all of it. It doesn't take too much additional effort to post it on a bulletin board, or certainly these days to send it out in an e-blast to all of your players and parents, so that the parents can stay off your back because they're seeing in real time, their little darling is getting her rear end kicked in. So please don't ask me why she's not playing more minutes. And so there's so much value to being completely transparent, but also being transparent about what's important. And what's important is for everyone to compete.
It's good. I'd love to be a part of those practices. I would, there's a lot to follow up on in there. I guess I want to start first with culture. I know how important that is to you. You mentioned off the air about this book. What are some best ways to go about creating a healthy culture, the culture that you're wanting? And I'd be interested to know how players over time impact that culture, or the culture impacts the players.
Well, first of all, I think both happen. I mean, ideally, if we could sort out a way to bring in young women with a wonderful set of core values, if we could figure out how to evaluate that before they got here, my culture would be even better. Because we're still at the point where we're looking at kids when they're in training environments and playing matches, and we're trying to evaluate them based on playing performance. And sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we'll bring a kid in, but even though they're fantastic players, they don't really fit into our culture. So here's what I consider the three most important pillars in our culture. The first one we've addressed to some degree, and that's the cauldron. When I was a young coach, Dean Smith, our legendary former basketball coach, who was also Michael Jordan's basketball coach in college, used to invite me to watch his practices. And he would invite me and my entire staff to come in and study what he did in practice. And honestly, watching his organizational capability and what he did with his analytics was just stunning for a young coach like me. And what was impressive is he would have all his assistant managers scattered around the gym. It looked like he had an assistant manager underneath every single basket. And that manager with a clipboard would be recording every time a guy hit a shot or missed it, every time he hit a three-pointer or missed it, every time he boxed out or failed to, if it was a 3v3, 2v2, 4v4, 5v5 scrimmage. It seemed like all this data was being collected. And then you would see at the end of practice, all these guys with clipboards that were underneath each of the baskets sprinting to the scores table where the head manager would be sitting. And then you would see this head manager in a scramble grab these pieces of paper out of the hands of his assistant managers, and he'd be compiling that day's practice data. While Dean Smith was addressing the troops at the end of practice, you would see this guy just scrambling to come up with a ranking in practice that day. And when Dean would finish addressing the troops, you would see him turn around. By this time, the head manager would be standing there, and he would hand Dean Smith a ranking of the 12 to 15 players in practice ranked based on some sort of algorithm of shooting percentage, winning and losing, boxing out, failing to, or whatever. And all of a sudden, the top 5 guys would leave to shower immediately. The next 5 would line up to do suicides. And the last 5, I assume, will be doing suicides until the end of recorded time. And I love this. I love the accountability. I love the immediacy of the feedback. I love the fact that, the 5 guys that left immediately, their chests were puffed out because they knew they had a great practice. And the ones that didn't make it, you could see them a little bit disappointed and then maybe mentally resolving for the next practice to do a lot better so they could march out of practice without a suicide. And I love this. We took this, we soccerized it, we took it to a completely different level. And I know the beginning part of this question was, what I would recommend the coaches record in practice. I don't want to sort of skew someone in my direction. I think we all have ways we value, playing performances of the players, regardless of the sport, or if you're running a business, what do you value in your business? Well, what you have to sort out is how to basically reward the people for that value. And so for a true competitor, what's value enough is to sit there and look at the bulletin board and see, oh yeah, I was number 1 in this. I was top 5 in this. I was top 10 in this. Top 10 is good in our program because top 10 for a field player, which means you're a starter. So we have 28 different categories. And so at a minimum, you should fight your way into the top 10 because that demonstrates in at least that quality, you're a UNC women's soccer starter in that quality. We also think anyone in the top 5 is going to not just sign a pro contract. We think you have the potential now to get a look for the U.S. Olympic team and U.S. full national team. So you are fighting your way up these ladders to demonstrate who you are as a player because your dreams are big. So the competitive cauldron for me is a critical part of our culture. The girls embrace it. So there's no question about being competitive. Either you're competitive or you just won't survive this culture. Or you're not competitive enough. And if you do survive the culture, you're not going to play. So these are choices you get to make if you want to get on the field. So that cauldron is vital. And you've got data, just like Dean Smith gave his players right after every practice. We have the stuff posted before the next practice. At the end of the year, we have a cauldron where all 28 things in an algorithm are averaged together. So you see who is number 1 in practice. We also have in real time the in-stat ranking of every one of my players in games. We also have basically, which is a part of the cauldron, a ranking of how your GPS unit has done in practice and in games. So the GPS units, which you're wearing in your jog bra in the back, are distance covered. How much of that distance was done in a sprint? What your acceleration ranking was on the team, what your deceleration ranking was, what your HML impact was, which is you changing directions explosively in practice. You're evaluated in 6 different areas with a GPS unit that obviously has no prejudice. It's basically on your back, so it's not someone evaluating you. This is you. This is your GPS ranking. So we give them all this data, which they can use any way they like, by the way. We don't force them to look at it. Some players don't look at it. Some are just look at it in huge detail, but the feedback is extraordinary. Another pillar that's critical is what we call our core values. Our core values are 13 different quotations that the girls have to memorize, be able to recite, but also live, because their teammates are going to be evaluating them against those 13 core values twice a year. The top award at our banquet is not the MVP. The top award at a UNC women's soccer banquet is the Kelly Muldoon Award for Character. So I want my kids to live on a never-ending ascension in terms of their human evolution. So yes, a critical pillar is the cauldron. And that was the first sort of pillar that we built. The second pillar was the core values. So a kid coming in as a freshman has this memorized and ready to share with everyone in practice whenever I ask her to recite it in practice. To be a force of fortune instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining the world will not devote itself to making you happy. That's a George Bernard Shaw quote about not whining. We want to have a culture where they basically are resilient and they can handle anything. And we have 12 more similar to that, but also in different areas that will dictate what we want their behavior to be in their 3.5 to 4 years with us as undergraduates. The final piece in our culture is trying to get their personal narrative to the truth. This is very difficult, especially today. Everyone has a personal narrative that is basically a litany of excuses for why they haven't achieved what they wanted to achieve. It is designed to protect them from pain, and it is designed to protect them from responsibility. And so what we try to do in our player conferences is to get their personal narrative to the truth. Those 9 things I mentioned earlier: self-discipline, competitive fire, self-belief, love of the ball, love of playing the game, love of watching the game, grit, coachability, and connection. Those are the things we want them to evaluate themselves in on a 5-point scale. I'm sitting there listening to them evaluate themselves in those 9 categories on that 5-point scale, and I want them to be as accurate as possible. If I disagree with their self-assessment, I will share why I disagree, and we will come to a consensus. Because as soon as someone understands themselves, they can change who they are. Most people don't understand themselves. They don't understand where they're extraordinary, and also very few people understand where they need to work. These player conferences are a very transparent discussion of that. So the first thing we talk about is self-discipline. 5 is a U.S. Olympic caliber player in this area. 4.5 is a professional level player in this area. 4 is a UNC women's starter in that area. 3.5 is a kid who plays in every half. 3 is a kid who makes the travel team. Below 3 is a kid who doesn't travel or play. So all of a sudden, I've thrown this out, and this is a freshman. She's sitting in front of me. And obviously, this freshman wants to start desperately. So I say, where do you evaluate yourself in self-discipline? And she's thinking to herself, well, he says 4 is a UNC starter. I'm going to say 4. And then I'm going to ask, what'd you do on the beat test? And she's going to say, I got a 28. And then I'm going to ask her, what's the UNC women's soccer standard in the beat? She's going to say a 40. All right, since you got a 28 in the beat, I'm going to give you a 2.8 in self-discipline. All right, now the kid is terrified, because now the kid thinks that I have a way to get her sort of personal narrative to the truth with something analytic and data-driven and objective. And now all of a sudden it makes the conversation better. So then we get to competitive fire. And so from then on, she can sense that this is not a BS session. This is the truth. It's sort of like that wonderful session in that movie, that line in A Few Good Men, where he asks, is it the truth? And you can't handle the truth. So basically, yes, we are getting these kids to the truth in this conversation. And all it is to get their personal narrative to the truth. And it's a very aggressive player conference to get them there. And all of a sudden, once they realize that this is very transparent, we get them there. And those are the 3 most important pillars that support our culture.
Man, that's truly good stuff. I love everything that you're saying here, and there's so much to dive into. I guess I would like to go back to recruiting. I always said, at least when I was a coach, it's like there were some people out there that could have played for anybody else, but maybe they couldn't have played for me. It wasn't their fault. It was just because we set those parameters and expectations of what those things were. Like, what I love about it is you're direct and to the point, but you're providing clarity as well as accountability through the system. Now, that's not for everybody, coach. And obviously that's why they're not playing there. But what would you say to people right now? I don't care if it's another coach that's listening or if it's a business owner who's trying to hire employees. It's all the same, right? So you talked a little bit earlier about evaluating. How do you start, or where do you start, in fact, on finding these people for your business, for your program? Is there a process of elimination with that? What suggestions would you give people that are looking for that, once again, in the workplace, or they're a coach of a team at any level?
Well, obviously for us in the coaching profession, we're watching them play. If a kid is an incredibly exciting player, this gut feeling that if I get them, I can help with my culture construct them in the way I want. but I've learned through experience and the school of hard knocks that is not always the case. Every now and again, you can make a mistake. There was a stretch when I was speaking for Franklin Covey. I was one of the warm-up bands. Franklin is the time management side of this leadership company, and Covey was the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People side. And Hiram Smith, who's a friend of mine, was the Franklin side of Franklin Covey. And he and I and Stephen Covey were all warm-up bands for Jack Welch, the famous CEO of General Electric. Basically, we would give our talks, and then he would sit up on a stage in a comfortable chair with an editor of Forbes magazine, and he would answer questions. And I was thinking to myself, oh my gosh, that's the gig I want. I don't want to prepare for anything. I want to sit in a comfortable chair and have someone ask me questions. One of the things I really learned from him was, and he would always mention this, and everyone in the room, and keep in mind, these were very popular seminars, they would all gasp when he would say this. He would say, every single year, fire the bottom 10% of your workforce.
Right.
And of course, everyone, especially these days, they would be so upset with that because obviously my impression coming into this environment would be, no. I work really hard with some of these kids to get them to the promised land, and it's paid off and blah, 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 blah. And of course, everyone in the room is saying the same thing. They would be raising their hands or trying to horn in and say, no. I had this one salesperson that I worked with, and they went from one of the worst people in my firm to one of the best. And it was because of my commitment to them. And he would patiently listen to everyone's objection to what he was saying. And then he would calmly say this. He would say, well, first of all, the amount of time you invested in that substandard employee, if you would invest that into your top employees, your bottom line would be better. And you're not a social worker. You're a businessman, and your responsibility is the bottom line. And the bottom line is that, that widow that decided to invest in General Electric, she's got to get that dividend. And if I am working my rear end off to save, some of my substandard employees and not worried about my bottom line, I'm not serving my mission. My mission is to make sure that widow gets the maximum dividend for her investment in my company. So he would start with that. And then he would also say, by the way, when you do fire them, they're going to hate you for the rest of their lives, but they don't want to work for you. And if you fire them, they might find a company where they would be a better fit, where they would enjoy working. And all this made so much sense to me as a soccer coach, because I was in the rehabilitation business. And there are some environments where you have to be in the rehabilitation business, because I was at a leadership seminar at the Naval Academy, and I was sitting on a stage with a Marine general, a U.S. senator, and someone else. I can't remember who the third person was. And I remember telling the story, and then the Marine general basically came back against my story to say, no. There's some environments where you have to take care of your people. Because in the Marines, you don't get to fire a Marine. Mm-hmm. In your platoon, you do have to reconstruct them. So I don't pretend for a minute that this applies across every single environment. It doesn't. And that was a wonderful lesson taught to me by this wonderful Marine general. But in my environment, it made sense. If a kid doesn't fit into my culture and they're on scholarship, I have to get them to transfer. If they are not playing, I have to get them to quit, because these kinds of individuals are poison for the culture. Mm-hmm. To have the courage to confront them. And at the sacrifice of this individual, I have to preserve basically the culture and the team. So this is something I learned a long time ago from working for Franklin Covey. And it's a very difficult moment, because in those moments, and I'm going to have my player conferences in January, I've got to sit down with these kids and tell them, you know what, you seem to be struggling not playing. There are a lot of schools where you can play. Do you need me to help you find a school you can transfer to where you can play maximum minutes? Because it doesn't look like you're very comfortable on my bench. And it has to be one of these very frank conversations where I certainly have the kids' interest at heart, but I also have to protect my culture. And I learned that, again, from a great man and working for a fantastic company.
Yeah, good story. Can you tell us the biggest difference between kids nowadays and 40 years ago? And what advice would you give to the leaders that are out there? You know, hey, do I adjust to this and meet them halfway? Do I go as far to all the way on their side? Do they need to come to my side? When I'm talking to leaders, it seems like they're kind of stuck in between sometimes, and they lack conviction on what to do with that.
We are sort of stuck in the middle, but let me share what I think the problem is and what we try to do to solve. Well, first of all, the self-esteem movement has ruined our children. They no longer come into college with any real resilience. They also lack patience. And a part of lacking patience is they all expect to come in and start first game as a freshman. Mm-hmm. Of course, all of us coaching at a collegiate level have a roster anywhere from 26 to 30 players. And so there might be some veterans there that you're not going to push off the edge. And so you might have to be patient when you come in. And I really enjoyed this when I interviewed my football coach, Mac Brown. And I had him on my podcast, which I'll chat about later. But what I loved about listening to him is the huge challenge a college football coach has. Because his roster oftentimes is anywhere from 90 to 120 players. And of course, only 11 are on the field at any one time. So his major management problem is these kids that aren't on the field. So how do you create a culture where you are trying to develop patience, where you are trying to develop a kind of resilience, a kind of toughness? Because that's the sort of culture that these kids are going to end up when they end up out there in the real world. And what's happening right now, because of the self-esteem movement, everyone's been praised for basically doing nothing. And so the average kid that comes into our program, even the ones that are quality players, have never had any sort of obstacle they've had to navigate in their lives. And part of what's protected them is their posse, which is usually their mom and dad, and maybe their youth coach, and maybe one or two friends that have been protecting them from the chaos of the universe from the beginning. And all of a sudden, when they run into a bump in the road and things aren't overwhelmingly positive because they're not playing maximum minutes, they sort of melt down. And we're losing this resilience. We're losing sort of a mental toughness. And it's becoming a part of our culture right now. So what's vital for us is this is where our core values step in. And this is where our principle-centered living steps in. And a lot of our core values actually deal with you having the courage to basically support the team and the mission, even when you're not playing. And so this is a part of human evolution because we're preparing these young women for the real world where not everything's going to go their way. And I'm proud to say that a lot of our graduates end up doing extraordinarily well because it hasn't been easy on them here. And so one of my favorite compliments given to me by a player in the last couple of years was a kid that was playing professionally. And she was struggling. And of course, she had all these negative things to say about her pro coach. And the last thing I will ever do is to jump in with a player against her coach, or pro coach or national coach or anything else. Because then you're basically setting this kid up for failure because then you're giving them an excuse for not succeeding in the environment they're in, which you never want to do. And so she was saying, and this was a wonderful backhanded compliment. She said, Anson, when I played for you, I thought I could go anywhere and play for anyone. Basically saying, it was so hard to play for you. I didn't think there was an environment in the world I could go into that would be tougher than yours. And I knew what she was saying. And she said, but, when I played for you, I could feel the love. And that went right to the middle of my heart. And I think this is the balance we have to have now as leaders. We have to hold them accountable. And in the meeting, or in my case, the player conference, I've got to be transparent and tell them the truth. But then I'm going to tell them what they should be able to do if they will just do this to get them to where they want to go. Mm-hmm. And in that conversation, they've got to feel my love. They've got to feel that I care about them. And then at every opportunity, they've got to feel my support. And there are times when the players that need to feel my support the best are the ones that don't even travel. And I learned about this from the wonderful Stanford volleyball coach who meets Kevin Hambley, who meets with his players on a regular basis. And when he meets with them, he doesn't even talk about volleyball. He just talks about their lives. And he meets with them all the time. And I was thinking, you know what? I've got to start doing that more aggressively, and I'm doing it already. And he taught me a wonderful lesson about that, because you know what? It's not about soccer. It's about connecting with the kids that play for you, connecting if you're an employer, the people that work for you. And what they have to sense all the time is your genuine concern for them above and beyond the job. So if your conversations with them are just about the job and not about their lives, you're not going to be able to lead them, especially if the people that are working for you or playing for you are women, because they have the superior understanding that this relationship with you is more important than anything else if you want to lead them. And so you can't lead women with hierarchy or with memorandum or just with, bonus checks if you will just do this. That doesn't work. There's got to be something above and beyond. They've got to have a sense that you care for them individually, you think they're unique, and you think they bring particular value to your team or your organization. So these are difficult times for all of us that are coaching, but also that are employing people. But I think this love that they have to feel, that has to go above and beyond, they're working for you or they're playing for you, is absolutely critical. So the demands made on us right now are a heck of a lot greater.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I'd be curious to follow it up then with what are you seeing from elite coaches? Like, what are the common attributes or behaviors that these elite leaders display?
Well, let me share Tim Corbin's thing, the Vandy baseball coach, which I absolutely love. And I've got to figure out a way how to get there, because I don't think my structure is as good as his. He makes the analogy, I'm not going to get this perfectly right, but maybe you can bring Tim on the show and drill into his culture more aggressively than I'm able to explain it. But let me give what I got from Tim. He looks at his 8 field player starters as people all sitting at a dining room table. And obviously he's got a pitching rotation. So let's deal with the 8 kids that are there that are starting for him. He's got these other kids that basically are serving the meal. That's the rest of his roster. So what he trains all of his kids in, as soon as they arrive, is serving the 8 that are sitting and eating. Because eventually, if you're good enough and you work hard enough, you'll be sitting at the table, and then there'll be another collection of people serving you. The way I'm going to draw this analogy with my kids, and I'm so glad you asked me this question, is I'm going to try to work something out this winter and spring. I'm going to structure it a little bit differently, because we have kids that also play in every game that don't start. So let's use and I will use all 11 players. I'm going to start a goalkeeper. Obviously in baseball, there's a pitching rotation. So, for anyone that knows anything about baseball, all of you guys would have a better understanding of how that pitcher rotates in to eat. But basically, I'm going to have 11 people sitting, because that's how many people start in my game. But also, I try to sub in at least another 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people that are going to be standing around the table, directly serving the ones that are eating. And then when that group finishes their meal, I'm going to have the rest of the team standing against the wall, sort of like if you've ever seen Downton Abbey, the way the valet and the other servants are standing against the wall, ready to serve the aristocracy in this wonderful public broadcasting system show. So I'm going to have sort of 2 layers on my group that's eating: the group that eats first, the group that gets up And the other group that was just serving them now sits down and they eat second. The people that are standing against the walls that don't play a minute are now serving them. So I'm going to try to figure out a way how to structure that and use that sort of metaphor to try to get my kids to buy into this. Maybe the next time I have Mac Brown on my podcast, I'm going to ask him, well, what are the tricks that you use? And they're certainly not, I don't want to make it seem as unsophisticated as tricks, right. But is to make sure your 120th player is happy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's tough. That's tough. Just to wrap up before we get into 3-pointers and talk about the books and podcast, I was going to ask who I should have on here that I haven't had, but maybe you've answered that already. And Tim Corbin, it'd be great to have him on, of course. But just tell us real quick. We like to talk on here about how you're growing, Coach. Like, are you a reader? And if you could drop a book or two that you like, or you're a podcast guy, what are some of the ways that you're growing at this point of your career?
Yeah, I read everything I can. So that was the nice thing about this Georgetown professor that spent the fall with us. Her name is Christine Porash, and she's a Keenan Flagler PhD in business. Keenan Flagler is our business school here at UNC. So all of a sudden, I think I was on a podcast, or maybe she was listening to a podcast I was on, but then she and I connected somehow. So she's down here on sabbatical, and we're writing a book on culture. And in fact, we're going to be roping in Tim Corbin as well, and maybe some of the other people that I really learned so much from, Pat Murphy and Kevin Hambley. And there were just so many wonderful people that I connected with on my sort of regular podcast when I was educating myself. But what we're trying to explore is I guess, our core principle at UNC, which is living on a never-ending ascension, which means I think I'm in the human development business as a priority. And so for me, it's obviously developing your core values, developing your academic platforms and your education, and then finally developing yourself as a soccer player. So for me, it's trying to get better in everything. So that also applies to me, certainly. So the way that I guess, sharpen myself, to use a Stephen Covey metaphor from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I do it through reading. And I read absolutely all the time, and I read everything. If I just read the discipline I enjoy most, all I would read is biographies, but I force myself to read, everything else under the sun. And so right now, Chris Porash has me on a reading list. So I'm just reading a lot of the people in the business world I haven't read recently. Adam Grant is one she recommended right out of the gate for me. And I'm reading his stuff, which is, endlessly fascinating for me. I'm a huge Michael Lewis fan. Obviously Moneyball, which certainly applies directly to sport. But also his other books are also absolutely brilliant. And he's got a fantastic podcast that's out there. And so for me, it's reading, it's listening to podcasts. It's also doing this. Believe it or not, even in this conversation where you're asking me questions, in discussing this with you, I am learning more, even though I'm doing the majority of the talking. For me, it's refining how this all fits together. Because if you had been on a podcast I had given, let's say, a year or two ago, it wasn't 3 pillars, it was 2. We hadn't fully developed the getting your personal narrative to the truth yet. It was something I was incubating and working on. And that was because of something I had seen in an elite player that wasn't getting to her potential, that I thought I had to change in my player conferences that we've changed now, that I think has been absolutely remarkable in affecting our culture. So basically, every single year, hopefully I'm going to change in a very positive way. But my inspiration comes from reading. It comes from obviously listening to people like you that have aggressive podcasts with interesting people, because I think that's the way we learn.
Yeah, for sure. Are you watching Ted Lasso there as well, Coach? Are you learning that at all, or what?
Yeah. And obviously, I don't pretend to, learn anything horribly profound from Ted Lasso. But he's certainly sharing with us that we should all treat people in a certain way. You know what? That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
So I think that we take ourselves too seriously in the coaching profession, where whenever we lose a game, we're about to throw ourselves off a bridge or something. No.
Right.
To be said for human connection, for caring about the people that are playing for you or working for you. And life is going to be so much richer if we can get closer to Ted Lasso's attitude about the way to treat the people around you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, hey, we're going to go rapid fire here. I call this 3-pointers. Maybe we'll go like 3 corner kicks or something here for you. All right. three penalty kicks. Number one, if people could learn one thing from this talk and just really grab hold on to it, just one, what would you want that one thing to be?
The most important lesson I've learned was given to me by a Sunday school teacher that was basically teaching us how to teach. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm a Mormon. And when this guy came in to teach us how to teach, the first thing he told us is everyone in our church is a teacher. And I really appreciated that because we are all teachers. But I think all of us are teachers, even those of us that don't have that as a formal title, and even those of us that don't coach. I think we're all teachers. And the first principle that he taught us when he was teaching us to be great teachers in our church is love those you teach. And that is the most incredibly powerful and positive lesson I can share with anyone. If you don't love the people that work for you and love the people that you're coaching, you're not going to be as good an employer or as good a coach as you could be if you just did that. Obviously, this is a fundamentally Christian principle that I think permeates the successful lives of so many people. But if I could leave one thing, it would be that. That's why the compliment I shared with you earlier, this girl told me, it was a backhanded compliment. After I played for you, I thought I could play for anyone. In other words, gosh, you were hard on me. But through the criticism, I could feel your love. That meant the absolute world to me. And if I can continue to do that as a coach for all of my players and yet still hold them to an incredibly high standard, I think I've accomplished my mission.
Good. Number two, if you could have come over here today behind the mic, what would have you asked of Coach Dorrance today that I did not ask?
Actually, you asked everything you needed to because I hit all the points that I always like to hit. I guess the one question I really enjoy answering, which is sort of a smart alecky answer, but I really enjoy giving it now. And by the way, this has also changed in the last couple of years. It's if you could go back and tell the young Anson Dorrance, something, what would you tell him? And if you would listen to the way I answered that 4 or 5 years ago, it's completely different from the way I answer it now. But the way I answer it now is I love this answer. I wouldn't tell him anything. I would want him to suffer for every mistake he made. And I wouldn't want him to avoid any of the mistakes he made because that has produced who he is. And have I made mistakes? Absolutely. But I have learned from every mistake I've made, and I would hate to protect myself from those mistakes because I think a part of learning from those mistakes have shaped who I am. There's a wonderful poem that everyone should read as soon as they get off this podcast. It's a poem by Rilke called The Man Watching. The Man Watching is also the title of a biography that Tim Carruthers wrote about me in my program. But there's a great line in there about the way we grow. We grow by being defeated by basically greater and greater things. And so I love that answer to that question, that I would not tell the young Anson a thing. I want him to have all those miserable days he had with all of his failures. And I want him to pick himself up off the ground and be where I am now.
It's good. Yeah, very good. Unique perspective there. Well, number 3, finally, good stuff is the name of this. What's some good stuff here that you can give us in closing, or maybe something that's on your mind or heart right now?
Yeah, what I would love is, let me just recommend a couple books for everyone. The most important book I've ever read is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. There's a wonderful line in that book about the last of the human freedoms. The last of the human freedoms is to choose your attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose your own way. Especially right now in this country where we've got, 2 tribes that are at each other's throats, 2 tribes that hate each other. My country is being torn apart, and I absolutely hate it. And I think we've got to have this wonderful Viktor Frankl attitude that we can shape our attitude in any circumstance and to still be positive. And so I think that would be a very important book to read. If you're a radically liberal individual, read David Foster Wallace's commencement address. This is Water. He talks about leading a compassionate life, and he starts with basically his liberal perspective of the world, and he arrives at this wonderfully giving, compassionate position. And by the same stroke, I want people to read, maybe right after this commencement address, which, by the way, you could read in the course of an hour, very comfortably, by David Brooks's The Second Mountain. David Brooks is a radical conservative. And what's really interesting is, even though David Foster Wallace is a radical liberal and David Brooks is a radical conservative, when you read The Second Mountain, you're going to arrive at the exact same spot that David Foster Wallace took you in his commencement address, which is to say that just because we're either radical conservatives, Republicans, or radical, liberals, Democrats, it doesn't mean we can't have similar truths leading us in the right direction. And so I would encourage all of your listeners to buy those 3 books. 2 of them are unbelievably short. Viktor Frankl is very short. Man's Search for Meaning is very short. The commencement address is very short and very easy reading. And then David Brooks's book is also easy reading, but it takes us to a wonderful place. And basically, for me, if we get everyone to read those 3 and we could arrive at the right place, we can save this country.
Thank you, Coach. All 3 there. Well, hey, let's just connect our listeners to you via Twitter, Vision of a Champ. And then if you could talk, please, about your books and then also the podcast as well and where they can find those, I would appreciate it.
Sure. So the 3 books that are out there that are still relevant are the first book I wrote, which is Training Soccer Champions. That book, everyone and their mother has used it to bring into their cultures, which I've really appreciated. I've had NFL coaches that read the book that use it in their cultures. I've had NBA coaches use it. It's gone across the volleyball community in a very aggressive way because it goes into some detail on the competitive cauldron. And regardless of the sport that you coach or the environment that you lead in, I think the principles of the cauldron can have value for you. So that's the first book that's out there that I wrote for coaches. The second book that I wrote for players that I think coaches can also read is The Vision of a Champion. Mm-hmm. That book has a podcast attached to it called The Vision of a Champion podcast. There are 20 chapters in that book. Each chapter has a different individual highlighting it. Some of the greatest soccer players in the history of the game I interview on that podcast. And some of the great coaches here at UNC, like Mac Brown and Roy Williams, are also part of that podcast. The final one, and this one would probably be the most enjoyable read, especially if you're not a soccer coach or player, would be The Man Watching, which is a book written by Tim Carruthers, which gets into the weeds about our culture, which might be interesting for anyone to read. So those 3 books, the ones I would recommend, with that podcast attached to The Vision of Champion. So I appreciate you allowing me to show those 3, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Coach. This has been an honor to spend some time with you. I have the utmost respect from you from afar, but and what you've done. But it's just so much more clear to me after spending time with you. I could do this for a long time, but I want to respect your time. And once again, I appreciate this, and go win number 23. All right.
I certainly will. Well, thank you for your time. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and good luck to you.
Thanks, Coach. Well, hey, everybody, as always, you can reach out to me at goodstuffkevin@gmail.com. Let me know what you think of this episode, and let me know if you need to reach out on any of the social media platforms as well, if I can help you with any of those books or podcasts. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, good stuff.